1962. A Mafia soldier sits in federal prison, trapped in the same walls as a boss whose name still carries orders. Then comes a message, a touch, a whispered name, a look he can't decode. In a world built on silence, one misread signal can become a death sentence. In 1962, the American Mafia still operated like a sealed machine, not because it was invisible, but because it was disciplined. It had rules for money, rules for violence, rules for loyalty, and one rule that mattered more than all the others: silence. Omertà wasn't just a romantic idea. It was a practical technology. It was the reason prosecutors could arrest men with cash, guns, and bodies around them and still never reach the top. It was the reason juries heard "I don't know" and "I don't recall" from men who clearly knew everything. It was the reason newspapers could print the word mafia and still not be able to explain how it actually worked. And inside that world, messages mattered. Not speeches, not memos, not letters, messages. Short, deniable, fast, sometimes just a phrase, sometimes a look, sometimes a touch on the cheek at the wrong moment. The entire system depended on the idea that you could communicate life and death without leaving anything a court could hold. Because in a society built on secrecy, the message isn't only information, the message is control. A boss doesn't need to announce his power if the room already knows what a small sign means. A capo doesn't need to threaten you if you've seen what happens to men who misunderstand. A soldier doesn't need to confess if he understands that talking doesn't just end him, it stains his bloodline. So the Mafia built a culture where even fear had a procedure. And that's where Joe Valachi enters this story, not as a mastermind, not as a kingpin, but as a man who understood the rules too well to survive them. Valachi was a soldier, the kind of man who did what he was told and stayed useful by not asking why. In the old structure, men like him were the muscle and the glue. They made collections, they carried envelopes, they moved weapons, they took the risks so higher-ups could keep their hands clean and their names out of police files. But by the early 1960s, the Underworld was under pressure in a way it hadn't been before. Federal investigations were getting smarter, wiretaps were improving, narcotics cases were exploding, and drugs created a special kind of panic: bigger money, bigger sentences, and a lot more desperate people willing to cut deals. At the same time, the Mafia itself was shifting. The generation that remembered the old street wars was aging out. New factions argued over territory, over income, over strategy, and hovering over all of it were the quiet internal audits that never made the papers. Who's loyal? Who's sloppy? Who's talking? Who's becoming a problem? In that environment, one accusation could be a death sentence, even without proof. Because in the Mafia, "I heard" is sometimes enough. The organization wasn't held together by written contracts. It was held together by reputation, ritual, and the constant fear that discipline could arrive at any time. That fear created a specific kind of paranoia, not random, not hysterical, but structured. Men didn't just worry about being killed, they worried about being marked. Marked didn't always mean someone openly threatened you. It meant the opposite. It meant you stopped getting invited. You stopped getting answers. A friend went cold. A handshake changed. Someone looked through you, not at you. The air shifted, and you could never walk up to a boss and ask, "Am I marked?" You didn't ask, because asking was an insult. It suggested the boss couldn't control his own people. It suggested you didn't trust the system. It also suggested you were nervous, which in that world can look a lot like guilt. So a man with a bad feeling did what men in that system always did. He watched for the message. The Mafia loved messages because messages did two jobs at once. They delivered an instruction, and they tested the receiver. If you understood the message, you proved you belonged. If you misunderstood it, you proved you were dangerous, either too stupid to trust or too unstable to keep alive. Most of the time, that worked in the Mafia's favor. In 1962, for Joe Valachi, it worked against them. Here's the central problem of this story. A secret organization can survive police pressure for decades, but it can be cracked by something more ordinary than a wiretap: human error inside the walls. Not a dramatic betrayal at a fancy table, not a courtroom ambush planned months in advance. A misheard order, A whisper passed in the wrong tone, carried to the wrong mind at the wrong moment, and the setting mattered, because by 1962, Valachi wasn't on the street anymore. He was locked away, surrounded by concrete, guards and other inmates, many of them connected, many of them violent, and many of them watching. Prison is where secrecy becomes harder, not easier. You can't control the room. You can't choose who stands behind you. You can't step outside to clear your head. You can't run. In prison, a rumor doesn't drift away. It sticks to you. It follows you from the mess hall to the yard, from the showers to the cell block. And because everyone is bored and hungry for leverage, information becomes currency. Even false information, especially false information. Now add the Mafia's internal logic to that environment. In the free world, a boss can send a message with distance and layers. In prison, the message is too close, the messenger is too near, the intention is harder to read, and the consequences are immediate. That's why a whisper in prison is never just a whisper, it's a potential trigger. For Valachi, the whisper wasn't comforting, it wasn't neutral, it sounded like a name, one name, and names are heavy in that world. A name can be permission, a name can be a warning, a name can be a death warrant. The danger isn't only the content of the message, the danger is what the receiver believes it means, because once a man believes he's been given up, everything he sees becomes evidence. A stranger looking too long becomes a spotter, a casual bump becomes a test, a laugh down the tier becomes confirmation. Even kindness can feel like setup. This is how paranoia is managed in the Mafia, not by calming the target down, but by isolating him until he makes a mistake. And that brings us to the turning point we're building toward. When people talk about the Mafia being exposed, they often imagine a clean moment. A brave witness stands up, tells the truth, and the empire collapses. That's not how it happened. The first real crack didn't come from bravery. It came from fear. Fear mixed with confusion. Fear that made a man act too soon, too hard, and in the wrong direction. Valachi's mistake wasn't simply violence. Violence was normal in his world. His mistake was thinking he could interpret the message faster than the system could clarify it. And once he crossed that line, the system did what it always does. It closed in. That's the real problem we're defining in Part 1. The Mafia's greatest strength, its reliance on silent signals and deniable communication, also created its greatest vulnerability. If your entire structure depends on whispers, then one misheard whisper can create panic. Panic creates actions. Actions create consequences. And consequences create opportunities for the outside world. Prosecutors, investigators, senators, people who had been waiting for years for a single weak seam to pull. By 1962, the federal government didn't need every secret. They needed one man inside the system to say, in plain English, how the system worked. Not a rumor, not a theory, a map, a vocabulary, a confirmation that the thing everyone suspected was real, organized and structured. Joe Valachi was not supposed to be that man. But a prison message, whether real, distorted or misheard, put him into a corner where the only options were death or breaking the oldest rule in the American underworld. And once that rule cracked, it didn't just affect him. It changed the balance between secrecy and survival for everyone who came after. Because the moment Omertà stops being sacred, the Mafia stops being myth and becomes evidence. Valachi's fear didn't start as a theory. It started as a physical sensation, what prison does to a man who used to have distance, options and friends on the outside. Inside, everything is compressed. You eat with men you would normally never sit beside. You sleep behind metal while other people decide when you move. And if you're a Mafia soldier, you're not just an inmate. You're a piece on a board that still exists outside the walls. By 1962, Joe Valachi was doing time on narcotics charges. He was already in trouble in the only way that matters to a Mafia man, not with the government, but with his own people. Because narcotics cases carried a special stigma. They didn't just bring heat, they brought long sentences. And long sentences create one unacceptable risk, the temptation to talk. So a man like Valachi walks into a federal prison with 2 targets on his back. The government wants him as a witness. The Mafia wants him as a potential leak. And then comes the detail that turns ordinary pressure into panic. Vito Genovese was there too. Genovese wasn't just another inmate. He was power, even in a cage, a boss who had lost his freedom but not his reach. A man whose name could still make people rearrange their behavior without a single direct order. In the Mafia, prison doesn't end leadership. It changes the method. On the street, you control with meetings, money, and fear. Inside, you control with proximity, allies and signals. The old rule still applies. Say as little as possible, but make sure the right people understand. And if someone needs to be disciplined, you don't announce it like a courtroom sentence. You send a message. Accounts of what happened next differ in small details, but the core is consistent in every version. Valachi became convinced he had received a signal from Genovese that meant he was finished. The signal people always remember is the kiss. Not a romantic kiss, not a theatrical movie moment. A quick touch on the cheek, done in a way that carried meaning only inside that culture. In Mafia folklore, it's the ultimate silent notice. You've been marked for death. Whether it happened exactly like the legend says, or whether Valachi later described it in a way that gave it symbolic weight, the effect on him was real. Because the power of a message isn't in how dramatic it looks, it's in how completely it rewires the receiver's brain. After that moment, Valachi didn't need a written order. He didn't need a confirmed plan. He didn't even need a direct threat. His mind began doing the Mafia math automatically. Genovese thinks I'm a liability. If Genovese thinks I'm a liability, someone will be sent. If someone is sent, it won't be obvious. If it isn't obvious, I won't see it coming. And in prison, you don't get a second chance. Now the paranoia becomes operational. Valachi starts reading the room the way he read streets in New York. Who's watching? Who's too quiet? Who's suddenly friendly? Who's positioned where? He listens harder. He notices patterns. He tracks routine like it's a surveillance map. And that's where the whisper enters the story. Prison is a loud place. Shouting, metal doors, guards barking orders, radios, footsteps, arguments. That noise creates cover. You can say something important in a low voice and be heard only by the person you're aiming it at. That's why whispers are dangerous in prison. A whisper can be a genuine instruction, or it can be nothing. And if you're already convinced you're marked, your brain will treat every whisper like a weapon being loaded. Valachi heard a name. One name, carried through a crowd, in a place where names mean more than numbers. A name that sounded like an instruction, or the confirmation of an instruction. A name spoken in the tone that made it feel final. Was it his name? Was it someone else's? Was it a surname? A nickname? A mispronunciation? A coded reference? That's the point. He didn't know for sure, but he believed he knew. And belief is enough to trigger a Mafia man into action, because the code trains you to assume the worst and move before you're moved on. In that mindset, Valachi began watching for the executor, the man sent to handle him. This is where the Mafia's message system becomes almost cruelly efficient. You don't have to send a professional hitman into a prison. You just have to create certainty in the target's mind that one exists. The target will often destroy himself trying to avoid the blade. Valachi zeroed in on another inmate, John Saunders. Saunders didn't have to be a famous gangster for the fear to stick. He just had to look like a tool someone could use. He just had to be near enough, often enough, in the wrong places. Mess hall, corridor, recreation, where coincidence starts to feel like a pattern. And once Valachi locked onto him, every small thing became proof. Saunders walks behind him. Proof. Saunders sits too close. Proof. Saunders sits too close. Proof. Saunders sits too close. Saunders looks up at the wrong moment. Proof. That's how paranoia turns into certainty. It builds a case out of fragments and calls it survival. Valachi didn't go to a guard. He didn't file a complaint. In his world, you don't ask the institution for help. You either handle it or you accept what's coming. And for a man raised inside Omertà, accepting what's coming is not courage, it's stupidity. So he chose the only move he believed he had left. He would strike first. One day in 1962, Valachi attacked Saunders with a makeshift weapon. Accounts often describe a pipe. It was quick, brutal, and one-sided, not a fight, an execution attempt. the kind of violence that comes from panic, not strategy. In Valachi's mind, he wasn't committing murder. He was intercepting an order. He was cutting a wire before it sparked. But the moment the body hit the floor, the prison didn't interpret it through Mafia logic. The prison interpreted it through institutional logic. An inmate killed another inmate. The response was immediate. Guards, segregation, interrogation, paperwork, charges. And here's the turning screw. When the adrenaline drained out, Valachi faced a new reality. If Saunders was not actually the man sent for him, then Valachi had just committed a murder for nothing. And if Genovese's people wanted him dead before, they definitely wanted him dead now. Because now Valachi wasn't only a potential informant. He was unstable. He was reckless. He was a problem that could attract attention inside a federal facility. Worse, his act signaled fear, and fear is contagious. A mafia organization can tolerate a soldier who's quiet and obedient in prison. It cannot tolerate one who looks like he might crack under pressure, especially not under the pressure of his own imagination. So Valachi found himself in the narrowest corridor a mafia man can enter. If he stayed loyal to Omertà, he would likely die inside prison, and die nameless, just another inmate who got into trouble. If he broke the code, he might live, but he would become a symbol of the worst kind, the man who proved the code could be broken. At this point, the government finally had leverage that wasn't theoretical, because prosecutors can threaten you with years, they can threaten you with court, they can threaten you with headlines, but a mafia boss can threaten you with certainty. Valachi now believed his death was not a possibility, but a schedule, and the murder of Saunders made that schedule feel even tighter. Even if he had misunderstood the original whisper, if it had been misheard, misdirected, or never meant for him, he had made the misunderstanding irreversible. This is what a misheard order does inside a closed system. It forces a decision that cannot be taken back. And in the days that followed, locked away and watching the clock, Valachi began to look at a different kind of message, the message he could send to the only power that might keep him breathing, not his family, not his crew, not a favor on the outside, the United States government, the same government he had been trained to treat as an enemy. Now, for the first time, it looked like the only wall thick enough to hide him from his own world. And that's the moment the Mafia always feared more than any wiretap. The moment a loyal man stops thinking like a soldier and starts thinking like a witness. Valachi didn't wake up one morning and decide to betray the Mafia. That's the myth people prefer, because it makes the story cleaner. What actually happened was uglier and more human. A man trapped in a place where he couldn't run, convinced that the code he had lived by was about to be used to erase him. And once he believed the message, he couldn't unbelieve it. Every hour he stayed quiet, felt like volunteering for his own funeral. So he made a decision that in Mafia terms was worse than murder. He asked for protection. That single request is the hinge of this entire case file. Because when a Mafia soldier asks the government for safety, he is admitting something bigger than fear. He is admitting the Mafia is real, organized, and powerful enough that even the US prison system can't casually keep him safe without special measures. The federal response wasn't sentimental, it was opportunistic. Investigators had been chasing the shape of organized crime for years. Pieces of it, fragments, local cases, corruption scandals, bodies with no witnesses. They knew there was a structure, but in court you don't win with everyone knows. You win with names, ranks, procedures, and confirmation from someone who lived inside it. And Joe Valachi, sitting in segregation after killing Saunders, was suddenly a man who could provide exactly that. Not because he was high-ranking, because he was low enough to know the daily mechanics and scared enough to talk about them. This is the part people often miss. Valachi's value wasn't that he could confess to being a genius. His value was that he could explain the system like a mechanic explains an engine, how introductions worked, what being made meant, how orders traveled, why certain killings happened and others didn't, how money flowed upward, how discipline worked without paperwork. Most importantly, he could confirm the one thing the Mafia had fought hardest to keep out of official language, the organization's identity. For decades, law enforcement used broad labels: the mob, gangsters, syndicate, organized crime. Those terms were useful, but they were also slippery. They didn't pin down a single national structure with internal rules. Valachi gave them a term that landed like a stamp: Cosa Nostra. Our thing, not a loose network, not a rumor, a thing with membership, hierarchy, and a code. When his testimony reached public view, it wasn't just a criminal talking, it was a cultural event. The US government put a Mafia insider in front of microphones and cameras, and for the first time, the country heard the organization described from the inside with the boring precision of lived experience. And boring is powerful. Because sensational stories can be dismissed as fiction, but procedure can't be laughed off so easily. When a man explains how meetings were arranged, how disputes were settled, how someone became official, the Mafia stops sounding like a newspaper ghost story and starts sounding like a corporation with guns. That shift is what made it a turning point. Not because Valachi personally toppled bosses the next day, but because he changed the vocabulary available to prosecutors, senators, journalists, and the public. After Valachi, it became harder for the Mafia to hide behind ambiguity, harder to claim there is no organization, harder for juries to believe this was just random street crime. And once the Mafia had a name in the public mind, the government could build strategies around it. You can't build a war plan against a chateau, but you can build one against a structure. This is also where the story loops back to what started it, the message. Because Valachi's testimony didn't just expose crimes, it exposed the Mafia's communication system, the way power traveled through deniable signals, the way discipline was delivered through implication, and the way fear was maintained without direct orders. In that world, the message is supposed to be clean, silent, efficient. It's supposed to keep everyone in line without attracting outside attention. But in prison in 1962, the message became noise, a name whispered, a signal interpreted, a rumor that hit the wrong mind at the wrong time. And once Valachi panicked, the Mafia's own rules trapped them. They couldn't publicly reassure him without admitting he mattered. They couldn't quietly remove his fear without getting close enough to create more suspicion. And if they did intend to kill him, even that plan became risky once he was in government hands. The irony is brutal. The same message culture designed to protect Omertà helped fracture it. Because the system depends on precision, and precision is fragile when humans are scared. That's the deeper lesson here, and it's bigger than Valachi. Secret organizations aren't defeated only by stronger enemies. They're often defeated by internal misfires, a miscommunication, an overreaction, a paranoid assumption that triggers a chain nobody can stop. When your whole empire runs on hints and coded gestures, your biggest danger is the day someone reads the code wrong and spills blood in the open. And that brings us to the uncomfortable reality of Valachi himself. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a clean moral figure who suddenly saw the light. He was a man who had done violent work, who lived by a violent code, and who broke that code when it stopped protecting him. His cooperation was survival first. But survival choices can still reshape history, because once the first crack appears, everyone starts hearing it. After Valachi, the Mafia didn't instantly collapse, but it had to adapt. It became more suspicious of its own members, more careful with language, more paranoid about prisons, where the government had time, leverage, and isolation. And that paranoia didn't make the organization stronger. It made it tighter, and tighter systems snap harder when pressure rises. From the government's side, Valachi's moment helped accelerate a new era, more targeted investigations, more focus on hierarchy, and eventually the legal tools that treated organized crime as an organization, not just a collection of individual offenses. So when you look back at 1962, you can see the outline of the turning point clearly, not in a courtroom, not in a gangster's mansion, in a prison corridor where a whisper became a verdict in one man's head. That's the story's final takeaway. In the Mafia, a message doesn't have to be true to be deadly, it only has to be believed. And once it's believed, it can force a man into actions that create evidence, headlines, and openings that outsiders can exploit. A misheard order doesn't just kill the wrong man. It can expose the whole system that relies on orders never being spoken out loud. And that's why Joe Valachi matters in the Power Files sense, not as a legend, but as a fracture point. The moment paranoia beat discipline, the moment fear outran loyalty, the moment the code that protected the bosses was turned by accident into a spotlight. Because the Mafia didn't lose control when Valachi started talking. They lost control the moment he started listening too hard.